Rain made the world smaller. It narrowed Hogwarts to a slick shine on ancient stone, to a dark line of trees beyond the lake, to the hiss of water on 100 cloaks. It reduced voices to murmurs swallowed in wool and grief. Harry stood with his hands clenched so hard he could feel the bones grind. Hermione's shoulder pressed his on one side, Ron's on the other, as if the two of them could bracket him against collapse. He kept his eyes on the tomb, white marble too clean for the day, too bright for the war that had crawled right up to the castle gates. It had the blunt finality of a closed door. Somewhere behind them Hagrid made a sound like an injured animal, a raw heave that didn't quite become a sob, didn't quite become a word. It was worse than crying. It was a body failing to contain what it knew. There should have been a speech. There should have been music. There should have been something, anything, that made the dead feel like an ending with a shape. Instead, there was only Minerva's face turned toward the lake as if she might command it not to lap against the shore. Her mouth had become a line carved into her skin. Her hands were folded so neatly it looked like a spell of restraint. Harry tried to think of Dumbledore as a person and not as a problem. The second came too easily. The first slipped away the moment he reached for it, like the last warmth from a hand you realize too late you stopped holding. He remembered a laugh in a bright office, the smell of lemon drops, a calm voice saying, "It is our choices," as if choices could be a shield thick enough for killing curses, as if a boy's stubbornness could outmatch the weight of a prophecy. The tomb sealed with a final shift of stone. Magic ran along the seams, subtle, almost polite. And then the marble sat there in the rain as if it had always belonged, as if it were simply another monument Hogwarts had been waiting to add. The last time Harry had watched someone go under the ground, he'd been a child who hadn't known what grief could do to him. Now he was older, and grief was not a single blow. It was a pressure that never stopped pressing, a tide that came back in no matter how many times you told yourself it was out. A flash of lightning showed faces turned into masks, professors, aurors, ghosts hovering like pale regrets. It caught the curve of the lake and turned it to hammered iron. It caught the line of Hermione's jaw, held too tight. It caught Ron's freckles stark against his wet skin, his eyes red-rimmed and furious at the sky for doing something as ordinary as raining. The rain kept coming. The war kept coming. And beneath the marble, the man who had seemed like the only steady thing in Harry's world was gone. Inside, the castle tried to pretend nothing had changed. It smelled the same. Dust and parchment and old smoke from torches. Its staircases still shifted with a groan. Portraits still murmured to one another with the furtive intimacy of people who believed secrets could protect them. But Harry felt the absence like a missing beam in a roof. The space Dumbledore used to occupy wasn't a room. It was a certainty, and now the castle's certainty had a hole in it. Minerva waited for them near the entrance to what had been Dumbledore's office. The gargoyle overhead looked damply unimpressed, as if it disapproved of mortality. She did not ask how they were. She did not offer comfort. Comfort was a luxury Hogwarts no longer knew how to afford. Her eyes flicked over them in the way she used to assess the aftermath of detentions. Hair uncombed, faces drained, hands too restless. "He left instructions," she said softly, and her voice almost broke on the word left. She produced a folded parchment from inside her sleeve, the seal pressed into wax, already cracked as if it had been opened and closed too many times in someone's mind. "Not for the Ministry," she added, and a muscle in her jaw jumped. "Not for anyone who thinks they can claim what he intended." Harry took the parchment. His fingers trembled, and not from cold. He did not open it immediately. If he opened it, what was inside would be real, and he had already had enough reality for a lifetime. Hermione moved closer, her damp hair clinging to her cheeks. "Professor, Headmistress," she started, caught between titles, caught between what the castle was and what it had to become. Minerva gave her a look that was almost kind. "Just Minerva," she said, as if stripping the honorifics might make the burden lighter. "For today." Ron swallowed. Are you staying?" The question had a child's bluntness to it, the kind that asked for a promise adults couldn't give. "I will," Minerva said. "As long as I can." She held Harry's gaze. "And you, Mr. Potter, you were supposed to have one more year of being a student." Harry stared past her, down a corridor where sunlight should have been and wasn't. "I'm not coming back." The words fell out of him before he could soften them, before he could turn them into something polite. He expected an argument. He expected anger. He expected someone to remind him he was 16 and had no right to decide the shape of a war. Minerva only nodded once, sharply, as if acknowledging an order on a battlefield. "I thought you might say that." She reached out, hesitated, then placed her hand on his shoulder with a careful, unsteady pressure. "Then do not be foolish. Do not be brave for the sake of being brave. And do not," her voice tightened, "do not go alone." Harry's throat burned. He didn't trust himself to answer. Minerva withdrew her hand like someone pulling away from a fire. "The train leaves tomorrow," she said briskly, forcing normality into the air. "I expect you will be escorted. The Order has made arrangements." The gargoyle above them clicked its tongue in stone, or perhaps Harry imagined it, and for a moment he had a ridiculous, fierce desire to laugh. Hogwarts had rules for everything. Curfew, homework, Quidditch fouls, but no rule at all for what to do when your headmaster was dead and the world was breaking. The Hogwarts Express was a moving silence. It should have been loud, a celebration of summer, a last hour of stolen youth. Instead, the corridors were muted, and the compartments filled with a hush that felt like respect and felt like fear. Even the trolley witch moved more softly, as if the clink of coins might draw something terrible to the windows. Harry sat with the sealed parchment on his knee. He watched the wax glint under the lantern's sway. He had opened it and read it, of course. The words had burned into him so quickly he suspected he would never forget them even if he wanted to. There were no riddles in it. No myth. No story. Just Dumbledore's neat handwriting, the kind that looked as though it had never known hesitation. "Harry," it began, "you have already learned enough to know what must be done." It spoke of Horcruxes in plain terms, of the locket and the cup and a snake that was not merely a snake. It reminded him, gently, terribly, that love was both shield and vulnerability, and that Voldemort would always mistake the two. And then, at the end, a single line that was not advice, but a plea. "Trust each other. The task will try to separate you." Harry read that line again now without looking, the way you touch a bruise to remind yourself it exists. Hermione's fingers were stained with ink from taking frantic notes even here, even now. She had brought half the library into their compartment, books stacked like barricades around her knees. Ron's foot bounced against the floor. Every so often he glanced at the corridor, as if expecting someone to slide open the door and announce that everything was cancelled, that Dumbledore was alive, that Harry could go back to being angry about homework and Quidditch. The train clattered over a bridge. Water below flashed silver. For a moment, the world looked almost normal, and that made Harry's stomach twist. "Do you think," Ron said suddenly, voice low, "that he knew about the ring?" Hermione's head snapped up. "What ring?" Ron gestured vaguely toward the letter. "The one he had. The one he had on sometimes." His ears reddened, as if embarrassed to bring up something so small when everything else was enormous. He never talked about it. Harry swallowed. He could still see it in his memory. A heavy gold ring with a dark stone. A family heirloom from a family that had rotted from the inside out. Dumbledore had worn it once in the library at the Burrow, months ago, and Harry had thought nothing of it at the time. Now everything unimportant had been retroactively sharpened into clue and threat. "He didn't mention it," Harry said. "Not in the letter." Hermione frowned, thoughtful. "If it was connected, he would have said." Her certainty was a rope she threw across gaps. He would have. Harry wished he could share it. He wished his mind would stop taking inventory of the dead. Cedric, Sirius, Dobby not yet, People he didn't even know who were dying in alleys and kitchens, because Voldemort had returned and made murder feel like weather. He reached into his bag and his fingers brushed fabric that felt like cool water. The invisibility cloak was there, folded tight. It was the one thing he owned that felt older than him, older than the war. His father's, yes, but also something else. Something that had held him safe in the castle corridors when he was small enough to believe danger could be outwitted by hiding. He didn't take it out. He didn't put it on. Not now. There were too many ghosts in the train. Outside the window, the countryside rolled by, blurred and wet. Somewhere out there was the Ministry, pretending it still had control. Somewhere out there was Voldemort, gathering strength. Somewhere out there were pieces of a broken soul that had to be found and destroyed, because there would be no other ending. Burrow looked the same and didn't. It still leaned into the sky with cheerful defiance, crooked and patched and stubbornly alive. But the air around it had teeth now. You could feel the wards even before you crossed them. A faint pressure against the skin, like stepping into a storm that hadn't decided whether to break. Molly was in the yard before Harry's feet fully hit the ground. She grabbed him with both arms, apron and all, and for a moment he vanished into the smell of flour and soap and something sharply floral that always clung to her like a spell. She held him too tight, as if the act of letting go might hand him to the darkness. "Oh, Harry," she whispered into his hair. "Oh, love." Arthur stood behind her, his glasses fogged, his wand out and angled toward the tree line. He looked older than Harry remembered, the way men look when they've been bracing for impact for too long. When Molly released Harry, Arthur stepped forward and gripped his shoulder, squeezing once, an adult's attempt to translate fear into strength. "There are eyes everywhere," Arthur said quietly. "We do not linger outside." They moved into the house in a rush of bodies. The kitchen was crowded with order members and Weasleys and wedding preparations that had become camouflage. Bill and Fleur were there, bent over a table strewn with parchment lists and ribbon and a half-finished cake that looked too bright for the mood of the room. Lupin, Remus, sat near the hearth, his face lined with sleeplessness. Tonks, Nymphadora, paced, her hair a restless shade of dark blue, her boots scuffing the floor with a soldier's impatience. Harry felt the Burrow's warmth press in on him, and underneath it the cold wire of what everyone avoided naming. This was a safe house, and safe houses had lifespans. Ron's brothers greeted him in a jumble of rough affection. Hermione endured a ferocious hug from Molly that left her cheeks red and her eyes shining. The normality of it nearly broke Harry. He had not realized how much he needed it until it threatened to turn into tears. Later, when the kitchen finally thinned, and Molly had retreated upstairs to pretend she wasn't crying, Harry found himself leaning against the garden door with Ron and Hermione. Night pressed its face to the windows. The wards hummed softly, like an animal sleeping with one eye open. "We can't stay here long," Harry said. Ron made a face like he'd bitten something sour. "I know. Doesn't mean I like it." Hermione's fingers worried at the edge of her sleeve. "We need information. The Ministry." "The Ministry is watching," Harry cut in. He thought of Scrimgeour's hard eyes, of how the government had tried to turn him into a symbol, and then blamed him when he refused to behave like one. "They want to know what Dumbledore told me." Hermione nodded once, sharp. "Then we tell them nothing." Harry stared out into the darkness where the orchard swayed. "We tell them nothing," he repeated, and in his mouth it tasted like the first step into a forest where you couldn't see the end. Scrimgeour arrived the next evening, and the Burrow seemed to shrink around him. He filled the kitchen doorway with his bulk, rain dripping from the hem of his coat. His eyes scanned the room the way a hunter scans a clearing, counting exits, measuring threats. Behind him, the night pressed close to the windows like a listener. Molly's mouth tightened. Arthur stood a little straighter. Remus's gaze went flinty. Nymphadora stopped pacing and went still in a way that made Harry think of a knife being drawn. Scrimgeour's eyes landed on Harry and held. "Harry Potter," he said, and his voice carried the Ministry's weight as if he brought the building with him. Harry didn't stand. He didn't bow. He didn't offer anything that looked like gratitude. "Minister?" Harry replied, and the words sounded like a distance, not respect. Scrimgeour sat at the table without being invited. He drew a thick parchment folder from inside his coat as if he were pulling out a verdict. "The late Albus Dumbledore," he said, and the word late cracked something in the room. "Left a will. Certain items have been bequeathed to you three. The ministry is required to deliver them." "No." Hermione's spine went rigid. Ron's hands clenched on his knees under the table. Harry kept his face blank, but his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it. Scrimgeour opened the folder. Ronald Weasley. He withdrew a small silver device, delicate, almost beautiful. It looked like a lighter, but it held itself with the self-importance of enchanted things. "The Deluminator," Scrimgeour said. "An object invented by Dumbledore. It has properties. He left it to you." Ron stared at it as if it might bite. "Brilliant," he muttered. "A torch snuffer. Really makes me feel special." Nia. Scrimgeour ignored him. "Hermione Granger." He drew out a book. It was old, bound in dark leather that had cracked into a web of pale lines. The title was stamped in faded gold, A Practical Inquiry into Horcruxes. "This volume was recovered from Dumbledore's private collection," Scrimgeour said, voice carefully neutral. "It's not available in the Hogwarts library." Hermione's breath caught. Her hands lifted as if the book were fragile and dangerous at the same time. When she took it, Harry saw there were handwritten notes in the margins. Tight, slanted ink that could only be Dumbledore's. A shiver ran through him, the eerie sensation of being touched by a dead man's thoughts. Scrimgeour's eyes narrowed. "Harry Potter." He withdrew a small, battered sphere, the first snitch Harry had ever caught, its gold dulled by years of handling. "Dumbledore left you this." Harry took it. The metal was cold in his palm. It did nothing. It didn't open. It didn't reveal a secret. It was simply what it looked like. An old piece of Quidditch history. Scrimgeour watched him as if waiting for a reaction. "And," he added, "Dumbledore attempted to leave you the sword of Godric Gryffindor." Ron sat up, eyes bright. Hermione's grip tightened on the book. "The Ministry," Scrimgeour continued, "has deemed it a significant historical artifact. It remains in Ministry custody for the time being." "Of course it does," Hermione said, her voice sharp enough to cut parchment. Scrimgeour's gaze flicked to her. "You may, Miss Granger, find it prudent not to take that tone with me." Hermione's eyes flashed. "You may find it prudent," she replied, "not to pretend you're protecting history when you're actually protecting yourself." For a moment the kitchen went silent except for the kettle's soft hiss on the stove. Harry could feel the wards around the burrow like a heartbeat, steady and tense. Scrimgeour leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Tell me what Dumbledore told you." Harry met his eyes. He thought of the letter, of that line. "Trust each other. The task will try to separate you." "He told me," Harry said evenly, "that you would ask that." Scrimgeour's mouth tightened. "This is not a game." "No," Harry agreed. "It's a war." Scrimgeour held his stare for another long second, then stood. "If you are hiding something that could aid the Ministry." "The Ministry didn't aid Dumbledore," Harry said, and his voice surprised him with its calm. "It tried to smear him. It tried to control him. Now you want his secrets." Scrimgeour's eyes hardened. "Be careful, Potter." Harry curled his fingers around the snitch until the metal bit. "Be careful," he echoed softly. "You too." Scrimgeour left with his coat trailing rainwater across the floor like a dark omen. When the door shut behind him, the burrow exhaled, but the air didn't get warmer. It only got more honest. Hermione didn't wait for anyone's permission. The moment Scrimgeour was gone, she pulled the book closer and opened it as if she were starving. The pages smelled like dust and smoke, like something that had survived fires. The text was tight and dry, heavy with Latin phrases and cold scholarship. But it was the margins that mattered. Dumbledore's handwriting ran like a second voice alongside the printed words. Observations, warnings, questions that cut cleanly through the ancient author's arrogance. Hermione traced one line with her finger, lips moving. "He's cross-referenced," she murmured. He's translated the runes himself." She looked up, eyes shining with a kind of grim excitement. "He's left steps. Not everything, but a recipe," Ron said darkly, turning the deluminator over and over. "Brilliant. I always wanted to be part of a recipe." Harry sat with the snitch in his hand, feeling its weight. It didn't stir. It didn't respond to his touch. In the past, he might have been disappointed. Now he felt almost relieved. There was no hidden comfort inside it. No promise. No soft way out. He set it down on the table. "It's just a snitch." Hermione glanced at it, then back to the book. "He chose it for a reason," she said automatically, and Harry heard her own need in the certainty. Her need to believe that Dumbledore had thought of everything, that the dead still had hands in the living world. Harry leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling beams. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "a thing is just what it is." Ron's gaze snapped to him, something like fear flickering behind his sarcasm. "Don't say it like that." Harry didn't answer. He could feel the cloak in his bag again, folded like a secret he couldn't quite speak. The cloak had been proof once, proof that magic could protect you, that you could slip away from danger and laugh afterward. But lately, every hiding place felt temporary. Every escape route looked like a corridor that ended in a wall. Hermione turned another page, the candlelight catching on Dumbledore's ink. "He's written here about the Locket," she whispered. "About the protections, about how dark magic can cling to an object, how it affects the mind." Her face tightened. "It's not going to be simple." Ron gave a humorless snort. "Nothing is." Molly hovered near the sink, pretending to scrub a dish that was already clean. When Harry looked at her, she flinched slightly, as if she'd been caught listening. "You'll eat," she said, "too brisk, too bright. All of you, you look like scarecrows." Hermione closed the book gently, as if closing it might keep its contents from spilling into the room. "In a minute, Mrs. Weasley." Molly's eyes softened at the honorific, but worry lived underneath, unmoving. She nodded and left, moving like someone who had learned how to walk quietly in a house full of fear. Ron set the deluminator on the table beside the snitch. Two objects that looked ordinary and weren't. Hermione's book sat between them like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. Harry looked at the three things and felt something cold settle inside him. A recognition that this was what Dumbledore had left them. Not answers. Not rescue. Tools and warnings, and the responsibility of choosing what to do with them. Outside, the wind worried at the trees. The wards hummed. And somewhere beyond the Burrow's thin circle of safety, the war waited, patient as hunger. Sleep came in fragments, sharp-edged and bitter. Harry lay on the narrow bed under the slanted roof and listened to the Burrow's sounds. The creak of wood settling, distant murmurs of voices below, the occasional scrape of a chair. The house held people the way a fist holds something precious. Too tightly. Too long. His scar burned in the dark. He pressed his palm to it, biting back a sound. The pain was not merely pain. It was intrusion. It was someone else's rage seeping into his skull like smoke. When the pulse eased, he sat up and swung his feet to the floor. The boards were cold. He moved quietly, because the night had taught him that noise drew attention. Attention from Death Eaters, from the Ministry, from grief itself. He opened his bag and pulled out the Invisibility Cloak. In the moonlight, it looked like a spill of pale water, impossible and soft. He spread it over the bed, smoothing it with both hands. The fabric resisted being pinned down. It wanted to flow, to hide, to become something other than what it was. For a moment he thought of his father, not the father in photographs, smiling on a broomstick, but the father in the dark days of hiding, wrapping the same cloak around himself and the woman he loved. He thought of his mother's laugh, which he didn't remember but somehow felt as a ghost sensation, a warmth behind his ribs. He thought of Dumbledore's tomb by the lake, white and sealed. He had been a child for so long, only a child with too much responsibility. People had kept telling him he was special, chosen, necessary. But the truth was simpler and harder. He was a boy with a target on his back, and the people who wanted him dead were winning more often than they were losing. Harry sat on the bed's edge and let the cloak pool around his hands. It was comfort, yes, but also reminder. It had saved him, but it could not win a war. It could not undo murder. It could not bring back anyone he'd lost. He could not help imagining, wildly, desperately, that somewhere in the world there might be an answer Dumbledore hadn't found. Some old magic, some secret door. But he heard his own thought and hated it. Wanting an answer like that was a trap. It was how people became Voldemort, afraid of death until fear became cruelty. He folded the cloak and put it back into his bag with a slow care, like laying a weapon down. When he lay back on the bed, he stared at the dark ceiling until his eyes burned. Downstairs, a clock ticked. Somewhere, an owl called. The Burrow held him for another night, and he couldn't shake the feeling that every night was a debt. The wedding should have felt like defiance. It did in flashes. There were moments when the Burrow's yard looked almost like the place it had been in Harry's early summers. Colorful bunting, enchanted lanterns bobbing over the grass, tables setting themselves with a soft clatter of plates. Fleur's laughter rang bright as a bell when Ginny teased her, and Bill, scarred, half-wolf and stubbornly alive, kept brushing a hand over Fleur's shoulder as if reminding himself she was real. But beneath it all, the Order's presence turned everything into strategy. Men and women stood at the edges of the yard with their wands tucked into sleeves, their eyes moving constantly. Protective charms shimmered like heat over the hedges. The air felt layered, celebration on top, fear underneath, and beneath that a grim determination that refused to go away. Harry wore dress robes that didn't feel like his. He was meant to be someone else today, some distant cousin, some harmless guest. His face was disguised with a simple charm that made his features blur in ways that left him looking like a boy no one would remember. It was almost worse than being recognizable. It was like being erased while still breathing. Hermione moved through the crowd with the competence of someone trying to keep panic from having space to sit down. She adjusted a ribbon, murmured a charm, smiled tightly at Fleur's aunt. Ron hovered near her, uncomfortable in formal clothes, his hands jammed into his pockets as if he didn't trust himself not to reach for his wand. Harry watched them and felt a fierce, sudden gratitude. Not for the wedding, not for the decorations, for them, for the fact that even now, even with death pressing close, he was not alone. Arthur came up beside him, eyes scanning the tree line. "If something happens," Arthur said quietly, "you go with Ron and Hermione. You do not try to be a hero." Harry's mouth twitched. "That's always the advice." Arthur's expression didn't soften. "This time, take it." Music began, soft, enchanted strings, and people turned toward the makeshift aisle. Fleur emerged in white robes that looked like moonlight made cloth. Bill's eyes went wet. For a moment, the world stopped being a war and became simply two people choosing each other despite everything. Harry felt something ache in his chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was longing for a world where choosing was enough. As Fleur walked past, she glanced at Harry, at the boy who wasn't Harry today, and gave a small private smile that made him wonder if she saw through the disguise anyway. Then she was gone, and Bill's hand took hers, and the vows began under a sky that pretended it was only blue. The vows were simple. They weren't dramatic. They were not spells or prophecies, just words spoken with a tremor that turned them into something sacred. Harry listened as Bill promised to stand and fight and flee if necessary, to love even when love was inconvenient. Fleur's voice did not break. Her eyes did not flicker toward the shadows. She spoke as if she were carving certainty out of air by force. Around them, guests shifted, some crying quietly, some watching the perimeter more than the couple. Kingsley stood near the far hedge, his posture relaxed in a way that fooled no one who understood what readiness looked like. Every few seconds his gaze moved, sharp and calculating, and Harry felt the comfort of it, a competent wall between them and the world. When the officiant lifted his hands to declare them bound, Harry's scar gave a sudden vicious throb. Not a warning like a needle, but a surge of heat that made his vision tilt. He swayed, grabbing the back of a chair. Hermione's eyes snapped to him instantly. Ron leaned in, face tight. "Mate." Harry swallowed hard. The pain receded, leaving behind the taste of ash. He shook his head once. "Not now. Not here." Applause rose. Fleur kissed Bill, and the yard erupted into cheers that were too loud, too desperate. People clapped as if noise itself could push death away. Then a Patronus burst into the yard. It was a lynx, bright silver, streaking between guests with urgency. It landed in front of Kingsley and opened its mouth. "The ministry has fallen," it said in Kingsley's own voice, echoing strangely from the animal's throat. "Scrimgeour is dead. They are coming." No. For half a heartbeat, the yard was frozen in stunned silence, like a painting held too long in the rain. Then, everything shattered into movement. Wands were drawn. Guests screamed. Fleur clutched Bill's hand, face going white but jaw setting. Molly turned, eyes wild, looking for her children the way someone looks for air. Harry's disguise felt suddenly pointless. He reached for his wand, heart hammering. "Ron, Hermione." "I've got you," Hermione snapped, already gripping his sleeve. A crack of apparition sounded at the edge of the yard. Then another, and another. Figures in black appeared like wounds in the bright day, masks gleaming. Wands lifted. Someone shouted. Someone fell. The air filled with light, spells colliding, the sound of magic like ripping cloth. Ron grabbed Harry's other arm. "Now." Harry yanked the invisibility cloak from his bag with one hand, but Hermione was already casting, voice fierce. "Protego!" A shimmering barrier flared in front of them as a curse slammed into it, sending a shockwave through Harry's bones. He stumbled. Ron cursed. Hermione's teeth clenched. "Disapparate!" Hermione shouted, and Harry felt her grip lock like iron. The world twisted. Apparition was always like being squeezed through a keyhole. This time it felt like being torn. They landed hard on pavement. Harry's knees buckled. Hermione stumbled but didn't fall. Ron swore loudly, spinning with his wand out. They were in Tottenham Court Road, the Muggle city pressing around them with its bright signs and indifferent traffic. It was jarring. The roar of engines, the glow of storefronts, like being thrown into a different world mid-breath. Harry's scar still burned a dull pulse. His stomach rolled with the violence of the jump. "Where?" Ron began. Hermione didn't answer. Her eyes darted, assessing. "Keep moving," she hissed. "Blend in." Harry's disguise charm was still on him. He looked like someone else, and for once it was useful. They moved through the crowd. 3 teenagers in robes hastily disguised as ordinary clothes by a flick of Hermione's wand. People glanced at them and looked away, their eyes skimming over the magic because Muggles had always been taught to. Harry's breath came fast. He kept seeing the yard. Fleur's white robes splashed with dirt. Molly's face contorted with terror. The flash of green light that had hit someone whose name he hadn't even had time to register. Did everyone? Ron started, voice cracking. "We don't know," Hermione said sharply. "We can't know." Harry's throat tightened. It was a horrible thing, not knowing. It was the kind of not knowing that made your mind invent endings. He forced himself to focus on the immediate. Escape, survival, the next step. A shout rose behind them. Harry glanced back and saw nothing but Muggles, until he saw the ripple in the air, the subtle wrongness that meant someone had apparated nearby. "Move," Hermione breathed. They turned down a side street, slipping between 2 buildings into a narrow alley that smelled of garbage and rain. Hermione raised her wand. "Protego totalum," she whispered, and the air around the alley thickened as if the world had drawn a curtain. "Where are we going?" Ron asked, breathless, eyes darting. Hermione's face was pale. "Grimmauld Place," she said. "It's warded. It's our best chance." Harry's stomach tightened. Sirius House. A refuge that had never felt like a refuge. A place full of shadows and portraits that screamed. But it was a place they could lock. Hermione grabbed them both again. "Hold on." And the world twisted, darkening, folding. Number 12 emerged as if it had been hiding behind the world's back. One moment there were two ordinary houses pressed together in a grim London row. The next, a third slid into existence between them, its windows dark and watchful, its door like a mouth that did not welcome. They stumbled up the steps. Hermione's wand was already moving, drawing protective spells into the air. "Muffliato, protego horribilis, salvio hexia." Her voice trembled on the words but didn't falter. Ron fumbled with the key, hands shaking. When the door finally swung inward, cold air rolled out like breath from a tomb. They stepped inside and shut it fast, pressing their backs to the wood for a moment, as if they could hold it against an army. The hallway was narrow, the wallpaper peeling, the smell thick, dust, old magic. Something like stale perfume. The darkness felt alive, not with creatures, but with memory. Serious laughter, his anger. The weight of a family that had worshipped purity and cruelty like gods. Harry's scar throbbed. He put his hand to his forehead, forcing himself to breathe. Hermione lit her wand. The light flared, throwing shadows up the walls. The portrait's eyes gleamed, following them. Somewhere upstairs, something creaked, settling. Ron swallowed. "Brilliant," he muttered, voice too loud in the house hush. "Home sweet home." Harry listened. No footsteps outside. No pounding on the door. For now, silence. Hermione sank onto the first stair, clutching her wand like a lifeline. "We need to check the wards," she whispered. "Make sure no one followed." Ron ran a hand through his hair until it stood on end. Did anyone see us disapparate from the wedding?" Harry's stomach turned. Images kept flashing. Masks, green light, Fleur's face. "I don't know," he said, and hated the helplessness of it. Hermione's eyes were bright, unblinking. "We can't go back," she said, as if saying it first would make it less sharp. "We can't. Not now." Harry nodded slowly. Somewhere deep inside him, something settled into place with a cold click. The last thread to ordinary life had snapped. The war was not outside the door anymore. It was in their pockets, in their breath, in the choices they would make next. From upstairs came a sudden shuffling sound, and then the unmistakable snap of a disembodied voice. "Thieves!" it shrieked, and the house seemed to wake like a beast. "Filth! Blood traitors!" Ron swore. Hermione leapt to her feet. Harry raised his wand, heart pounding. The darkness ahead of them moved. The portrait's scream was a weapon. Walburga's painted mouth opened impossibly wide, and the sound that came out filled the hallway until the wallpaper seemed to vibrate with it. Her eyes bulged with righteous fury, and spittle, painted absurd, flecked her chin. "Scum!" she howled. "Vermin, you dare!" "Silentio!" Hermione shouted, wand slicing through the air. Nothing happened. Walburga only screamed louder, as if the spell had insulted her. Ron lunged for the curtain rope, yanking with both hands. The heavy velvet fell and muffled the portrait into a furious, distant muffling, like a beast trapped behind a wall. The sudden silence left Harry's ears ringing. He exhaled shakily. His heart hammered against his ribs like it wanted out. Hermione's shoulders rose and fell fast. "Right," she said, voice tight. "We need to secure the house. Lock it down properly." Ron rubbed his hands over his face. "First thing I'm doing is finding something to shut her up permanently." They moved carefully through the ground floor. The kitchen was grimier than Harry remembered, like the house had been left to sulk. Old pans hung from hooks, dull with neglect. A mouse darted across the floor and vanished into a crack. Hermione cast more charms, her wand light sweeping, her voice a steady stream of incantations. Every so often she paused and frowned, sensing something in the air. The residue of spells laid long ago. The thick, stubborn magic of the Blacks, protective and poisonous all at once. Harry found himself watching her hands. They were steady now. He realized with a faint shock that Hermione had crossed into something new. She wasn't just a brilliant student anymore. She was a witch building a fortress in real time. Upstairs a door banged. A low, muttering voice drifted down the stairwell. "Master?" it said, thin and wary. Ron froze. "Kreacher," he whispered, and the name sounded like both annoyance and relief. The house elf appeared on the landing like a shadow condensing into shape. He was hunched and gray, his long ears drooping. His eyes were huge and watery, fixed on them with suspicion. He took one look at Harry and hissed. "Master Sirius is dead," he croaked, voice trembling with something like grief and hatred tangled together. "And now the mudblood and the traitor come to steal what is left." "Careful," Hermione said, sharp as a drawn blade. "We're not here to steal. We're here to survive." Kreacher's lip curled. "Survive? The blood traitors survive while noble houses fall." Ron's wand snapped up. "One more word and I'll—" Harry stepped forward, heartbeat hard. "Kreacher," he said, and the elf's eyes flicked to him, wary. "We need information. Regulus. The Locket. You know what I mean." "Nuntada, Ime, Anraim-T, Elfortur." At the name Regulus, something in Kreacher's face changed. His mouth trembled. His shoulders shook. And then, very softly, he whispered, "Master Regulus." Kreacher's voice broke on the name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of break that happened when something had been held too long and finally cracked. Harry felt Hermione's gaze on him, steadying. Ron looked as if he'd been about to snap and now didn't know where to put the anger. "Kreacher," Harry said again, softer. "Tell us, please." The elf's throat worked. He stared at Harry's face as if searching for something familiar and not finding it. "You are not Master Sirius," he whispered accusingly, as if that were a betrayal. "No," Harry said. "I'm not." Kreacher's shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked ancient, older than the house, older than the portrait's hatred. "Master Regulus," he began, and his voice was a thread pulled from deep inside him. "He was kind, not like the others. He listened." Harry sat on the stair, because his legs suddenly felt as if they belonged to someone else. Hermione sat beside him without a word. Ron sat one step above, still ready to jump. Kreacher's story came in pieces at first, as if he had to pry each memory loose. He spoke of being taken to a cave by the Dark Lord, of being forced to drink a potion that burned like poison, of being left to die. He described the lake, the inferi beneath it, the cold hands that had dragged at him when he tried to climb out. Harry's stomach churned. He had been in that cave. He had felt the water, had seen the pale bodies. Hearing it from Kreacher made it worse somehow, because the elf's fear still lived in his words. "And Kreacher came back," the elf said, eyes huge. "Because Master Regulus had ordered it. Kreacher came back to this house. Kreacher told Master Regulus everything." Cha. Hermione's hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Ron's face had drained of color. "Master Regulus was angry," Kreacher whispered. "Not at Kreacher, at the Dark Lord, at what he had done. He said the Dark Lord had made something evil, something with a piece of himself." Kreacher shuddered. "Master Regulus said it must be destroyed." Harry's pulse hammered. Hermione leaned forward. "The Locket," she said softly. Kreacher nodded, his ears flopping. The locket. Master Regulus took Kreacher back to the cave. He made Kreacher take the locket. He made Kreacher leave him there. No. Harry's throat constricted. He could almost see Regulus' face. He'd never met him. But he'd seen the photograph in Sirius's room. A pale boy with careful hair, eyes too serious. Master Regulus drank the potion, Kreacher said. And now tears slid from his eyes, running down the deep lines of his face. He drank it all, and he told Kreacher to go. Kreacher did not want to go. Kreacher wanted to stay, but Master Regulus ordered him. Kreacher could not disobey. Harry's hands clenched. Hermione's eyes were wet. Ron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. And Kreacher came back, Kreacher whispered. With the locket, and Kreacher tried to destroy it. Kreacher tried and tried and tried. His voice rose, frantic. But it would not break. It would not burn. It laughed at Kreacher. Harry thought of the locket he'd seen, the one they'd retrieved from the cave, bearing a note signed R.A.B. They had not found the real one. Kreacher, Harry said, voice rough. Where is it now? Kreacher stared at him. For a long moment he didn't answer, and in the silence Harry felt the household malice listening. Then Kreacher whispered, "It was stolen." The word stolen hit the air like a slap. Harry's mind immediately filled with images. Death Eaters ransacking this house, hands in drawers, laughter. Mundungus Fletcher with his shifty eyes and pockets full of other people's possessions. The world was full of thieves, and sometimes they didn't even know what they were stealing. Who? Ron demanded, voice sharp. Kreacher flinched. Mundungus Fletcher, he croaked. He came when Mistress was gone. He took things. Kreacher tried to stop him. Kreacher was punished. His fingers twisted in his rag. The locket was among the things taken. Hermione's eyes narrowed, calculating. Mundungus wouldn't keep it, she said. He'd sell it. Harry's scar pulsed once, a warning like a finger tapping glass. Where? Harry asked. Kreacher's lips curled. To a witch, a terrible witch, a toad. He spat the last word as if it were a curse. Dolores Umbridge. Hermione made a sound of pure disgust. Ron looked as if he might vomit. Harry closed his eyes for a second, forcing the information into order. Umbridge. Ministry. Ministry fallen. If Umbridge had the locket, it was in the heart of the place that had just become Voldemort's. Hermione's voice was very quiet. Then we have to go in. Ron stared at her. Into the ministry? Hermione's expression didn't wobble. Yes. Harry felt something inside him go cold and clear. This wasn't bravery. This wasn't heroism. This was necessity, the dull logic of survival. The locket was one of the Horcruxes. It had to be destroyed. There was no other path around it. Kreacher watched them, his eyes flicking between faces. You will die, he whispered, not cruelly, but as if stating a fact. The ministry is full of them now. Harry met his gaze. We might, he said. But if we don't go, people will die anyway. Kreacher's mouth trembled. For a moment, Harry thought the elf might curse him, might spit another insult. Instead, Kreacher bowed his head, the movement stiff. Kreacher will help, he whispered, and the words sounded as if they hurt. Because Master Regulus would want the locket destroyed. Hermione's face softened by a fraction. Ron looked startled. Harry felt the tiniest shift in the air, a change in the house itself, as if even the old walls listened when someone chose loyalty over hatred. The house became a workshop. Hermione raided cupboards with relentless focus, pulling out jars and ingredients, muttering to herself as she inventoried what they had and what they didn't. The kitchen table turned into a battlefield of parchment, maps of the ministry, lists of names, sketches of corridors drawn from memory and rumor. Ron ripped newspapers into strips with angry energy, scanning headlines that felt like blows. Ministry secures peace. New leadership promises order. Muggle-born Registration Commission announced. He tore one page so hard the paper shredded into confetti. Peace, he spat. Order. They've got the nerve. Harry stared at the words until they blurred. Each headline was a mask over a violence that didn't bother hiding anymore. Kreacher moved through the chaos quietly, setting down tea that no one drank. Once, Harry caught the elf staring at the kitchen wall, eyes distant, as if seeing Regulus standing there. His grief lived in the way he smoothed the edge of a folded napkin, the way he flinched at sudden sounds. Hermione began brewing polyjuice in an old cauldron that must have belonged to Sirius' mother. The potion bubbled thickly, a foul-smelling stew. Steam crawled up the walls. The house seemed to disapprove, but it tolerated. "We need hair," Hermione said, grim. "Or nails. Something from the people we're impersonating. We can't just make it up." Ron grimaced. "So we have to kidnap 3 ministry workers." Hermione gave him a look. "We have to borrow their identities." Briefly. Harry rubbed his forehead, scar tingling. "Which ones?" Hermione tapped a list. "People who can get us close to Umbridge. There's a man in magical maintenance, Red Cattermole. And," she hesitated, "and a woman in the Muggle-born Registration Commission." Ron's face twisted. "That place makes me sick." "It's why we have to go," Hermione said quietly. "If we can steal the locket and get out, we can also help someone if we see a chance." Harry watched her, and he understood the danger in her words. Helping people was good. Helping people inside the ministry could get them killed. The line between the two was thin and sharp. "We do the locket," Harry said, forcing his voice steady. "That's the mission." Hermione's eyes held his, and he saw her struggle. The part of her that wanted to save everyone. The part of her that knew they couldn't. She nodded once. "The locket," she agreed. Ron exhaled hard. "Right. In and out. Quick." Harry picked up Dumbledore's letter again. "Trust each other. The task will try to separate you." He looked at Ron and Hermione. The task wasn't going to separate them with myth, or temptation, or grand promises. It was going to separate them with fear, with hunger, with exhaustion, with the slow grind of hopelessness. Harry folded the letter and put it away. "Tomorrow," he said. Hermione's eyes widened. "Tomorrow?" Harry nodded. "Before they're fully settled, before Umbridge moves it or someone notices it's valuable." Ron's face went pale, then set. "Tomorrow," he echoed like a vow. The cauldron bubbled. The house creaked. Outside, London breathed its unaware breath. Inside, 3 teenagers planned to walk into the heart of a conquered government and steal a piece of a monster's soul. At night, the house did not let them forget what it was. The darkness in Grimmauld Place felt thicker than the darkness outside, as if generations of secrets had soaked into the plaster. Harry stood at a window and watched the street lamps fog over, turning the world into a blurred painting. The city looked peaceful from up here. It looked like a place where people went to bed and woke up and argued about ordinary things. Harry pressed his forehead to the cold glass. His reflection stared back, a stranger's face still clinging to him from the disguise charm, edges softened, eyes not quite his. He looked like someone who might live a normal life. Behind him, Hermione sat on the edge of a chair, polishing her wand with a rag she didn't need. Her hands trembled, barely. Ron paced, boots soft on the worn floorboards, stopping every few steps to peer toward the hallway, as if expecting Walburga's portrait to break free and start screaming again. None of them spoke for a long time. Harry's scar throbbed. He tried not to think of why. He tried not to picture Voldemort in the ministry, cloak flowing, eyes bright with triumph. "Harry," Hermione said suddenly, voice small in the room. Are you okay?" He almost laughed. It would have been a terrible sound. "No," he said honestly. Hermione's throat worked. "Me neither." Ron stopped pacing. He leaned against the wall and rubbed his face hard. "We're going to do it anyway," he said. Not a question. Harry turned from the window. The room's wand light made Hermione's face look carved, all sharp planes and shadows. Ron looked younger in the dimness, the freckles across his nose suddenly too boyish for what they were about to do. Yeah, Harry said. We're going to do it anyway. Hermione swallowed. The book, she whispered. Dumbledore's notes. He wrote about how Horcruxes defend themselves. How they can twist thoughts. Make you suspicious. Make you angry. Ron's jaw tightened. Brilliant. Harry felt cold creep under his ribs. He thought of the locket in the cave, how the air around it had felt wrong even before he'd touched it. He thought of the way it had glowed against his skin in his memory. Hungry. We watch each other, Harry said. If you feel off. If you start thinking things you wouldn't normally, tell me. Ron snorted. You want me to tell you every stupid thing I think? We'll be here all night. Hermione tried to smile. It didn't fully form. Harry stepped closer to them, the three of them drawn together by gravity and fear. We promised, he said quietly. We're not splitting up. Ron's expression flickered. Anger, fear, loyalty all braided. He nodded once. Not splitting up. Hermione nodded too. Eyes shining with unshed tears she refused to let fall. Not splitting up. Harry looked at them and felt something like warmth fight its way through the cold. The world could take so much. It had taken parents and godfathers and teachers. It could take sleep and safety and childhood. But it wasn't going to take them from each other easily. They took the polyjuice in a public toilet because war didn't care about dignity. The potion slid down Harry's throat like burnt mud. It made his skin crawl, his bones ache, his vision blur. For a moment he thought he might vomit. Then the transformation hit, sharp, brutal, like being shoved into a new body. When it was over, he looked into the cracked mirror and saw a stranger. Taller, broader, heavy-jawed, with anxious eyes. A man who might have a wife and children and a desk in the ministry, and no idea his life was about to be used as a disguise. Hermione, now a short, mousy-haired woman with tired eyes, grimaced at her reflection. Ron, now a thin, sallow man with a nervous tick in his cheek, pulled at his collar as if it were strangling him. Brilliant, Ron muttered in a voice that wasn't his. I look like someone who apologizes when you step on his foot. Hermione's borrowed face didn't manage a smile. Focus, she said, and her voice came out wrong too, higher, reedy. Harry gripped the sink, steadying himself. His heart hammered. He could feel the locket, imagined, not yet stolen, like a weight already hanging around his neck. They stepped back into the street and merged with the flow of London. The ministry entrance was hidden among the Muggle world like a secret wound. The closer they got, the more Harry felt as if the air itself had thickened with spells. They reached the telephone box, which stood at the edge of a side street, red and ordinary, and absurd. Hermione. No, not Hermione. The woman she looked like raised a shaking hand and punched in the numbers. 6, 2, 4, 4, 2. The booth shuddered. It began to descend. Harry's stomach lurched. The walls of the telephone box slid upward as they sank into darkness, the sound of the city fading above. The descent felt too long, too deep, like being swallowed. When the doors opened, they stepped into the ministry. The atrium was transformed. In Harry's memory, it had been bright, airy, full of gold statues and chatter. Now it was cold, the light dimmed. The fountain was gone. In its place loomed a massive black monument that seemed to drink the air around it. A witch and wizard stood atop a pile of bodies, muggles crushed beneath, arms reaching up, faces contorted. The words etched into stone made Harry's stomach twist. Magic is might. Ron made a strangled sound. Hermione's borrowed face went pale. Harry forced himself to look away. He could not afford to stare at horror and call it righteousness. He could not afford to let anger flare too bright. They moved, heads down, toward the lifts. Ministry workers passed them, eyes lowered, shoulders hunched. No one smiled. No one spoke louder than necessary. Harry felt the building's magic press against his skin, old and powerful, and now warped by new hands. They stepped into a lift and the gates slid shut with a metallic snarl. "Next stop," a cold female voice announced. "Muggleborn Registration Commission." Harry's pulse hammered. This was the throat of the beast. The corridors outside the commission felt like a courtroom and a dungeon at the same time. Posters lined the walls, parchment nailed like proclamations. "Register now. Wand permit required. Report suspicious behavior." Each message was dressed in ministry formality, but the intent was bare. Control. Divide. Punish. Harry's borrowed hands were sweating. Hermione's eyes flicked everywhere, taking in details, mapping exits. Ron's jaw was clenched so hard his muscles jumped. A man walked past them with a stack of files clutched to his chest. He didn't look up. His shoulders were slumped as if the building had been sitting on him for years. They approached Umbridge's office with the careful pace of people who belonged. Harry's heart felt too loud. He half expected his scar to ignite, to betray him. The door was ajar. Inside, a woman's voice cooed, sickly sweet. Now, Umbridge said. "There's no need to cry. If you are telling the truth, the quill will show it." Harry stepped closer and looked through the gap. Dolores sat behind a desk, her face pink and pleased, like a cat in a warm patch of sun. She wore a tidy robe with lace at the cuffs. On her chest, hanging from a chain, was the locket. It looked almost ordinary. Gold, oval, engraved. But the air around it felt wrong. It seemed to pull light into itself, to thicken the shadows near her collarbone. Harry's skin prickled. His stomach turned. A trembling wizard stood in front of her desk, his wand held out as if surrendering it. His eyes were red. His hands shook. Umbridge smiled wider. "There, you see? The quill has written its verdict." Harry's mind went cold. He felt Hermione shift beside him, a barely contained tremor of rage. Ron's breath came fast. They couldn't storm in. They couldn't shout. They needed the locket. They needed to get out alive. Hermione leaned close, voice barely audible. "Wait until she's alone," she whispered. Harry watched Umbridge lean back in her chair, fingers stroking the chain of the locket absent-mindedly, like a comfort. The wizard in front of her turned away, shoulders shaking. He looked as if he might fall. Harry's hands clenched. He thought of his parents. He thought of Hermione's parents, hidden away in ignorance. He thought of the word mudblood screamed from Walburga's portrait and turned into policy here. He swallowed hard until the urge to act became something he could hold. Then Umbridge reached for a file, and the locket swung forward, catching the lantern light. For a split second, Harry thought he saw something in it. An eye, a slit of darkness, watching him. His scar flared. He bit down on a gasp. Hermione's borrowed hand gripped his sleeve. "Harry," she breathed, warning. He forced himself to blink. The locket was just a locket. It was not alive. It was not a creature with teeth. It was an object infected with a soul piece and dark magic, and the weight of a monster's fear of death. It was, Harry thought grimly, exactly the kind of thing that would try to make you see shadows that weren't there. They waited. They waited until the wizard left. They waited until Umbridge's assistant stepped out to fetch more files. They waited until Umbridge hummed to herself, satisfied. And then Hermione pushed the door open. "Good morning," Hermione said brightly, and the borrowed voice made the politeness grotesque. Umbridge looked up. Her eyes narrowed, suspicious. "Yes? What is?" Hermione's wand flicked. Muffliato. The office filled with a faint buzzing, a thickening of air that swallowed sound. Umbridge's mouth opened to scream, and no scream came out. Harry moved. He crossed the room in 3 strides, wand raised. Umbridge scrambled back, eyes wide, her hand flying to the locket. Ron was at the door, slamming it shut, wand out. "Stupefy!" he barked toward the corridor, and a red flash shot through the crack just as someone tried to enter. Umbridge's eyes bulged. She clawed at her throat, trying to force sound out of a silenced mouth. Her hand stayed on the locket, fingers white. Harry pointed his wand at her face. "Take your hand off it." She shook her head violently, cheeks trembling. Tears sprang to her eyes, not from fear of him, but from fear of losing something she wanted. The locket. Voldemort's magic. Protection. Hermione's voice was icy. "Now, Dolores." Umbridge's gaze flicked to Hermione, hatred flaring. Her hand tightened on the chain. Harry felt heat surge up his neck. The locket seemed to pulse, faintly, like a heartbeat against Umbridge's skin. His scar burned. "Expelliarmus!" Harry snapped. Umbridge's wand flew from her hand, clattering across the desk. She still held the locket. Ron lunged forward and grabbed Umbridge's wrist, yanking hard. The chain bit into her neck. Umbridge's eyes went wide with outrage, and she flailed, trying to bite him. Ron recoiled with a curse. Hermione moved fast. Her wand flashed. "Petrificus totalus." Umbridge's body stiffened mid-flail. Her eyes still furious, her mouth frozen in a silent, hateful O. She toppled backward into her chair like a puppet with cut strings. Harry reached for the locket. The moment his fingers closed around it, the world went colder. It wasn't physical cold. It was a feeling, an invasive pressure behind his eyes, like a thought knot is trying to nest in his skull. He felt a surge of something, contempt, hunger, a cold laughter. Harry clenched his jaw until it hurt. He yanked the chain free. The locket fell into his palm, heavy, alive in the wrong way. Hermione's eyes flicked to his face. "Harry? I'm fine," he lied. Ron shoved Umbridge's wand into his pocket with a grimace. "Let's go. Let's go." Outside the door, footsteps hammered closer. Voices rose, muffled by Hermione's spell but still urgent. Harry shoved the locket into his pocket. It felt like dropping a stone into deep water. It sank, and he felt it sink inside him too. They burst out of the office into the corridor, and the Ministry turned its eyes on them. The chase was chaos in a building that demanded order. They ran through corridors that seemed to stretch and twist, past clerks with terrified faces pressed to walls, past Aurors who weren't Aurors anymore, men and women in dark robes with hard eyes and wands up. Spells cracked through the air, striking stone and leaving scorch marks that smoked. Hermione's disguise began to waver, her borrowed features slipping at the edges as panic and exertion broke concentration. Ron swore as his own hair shifted unevenly, his face flickering between stranger and himself like a candle flame fighting wind. Harry's scar burned like someone had pressed a hot coin into it. He could feel Voldemort's fury, sharp, cold, instantly awake, as if the Dark Lord had turned his head and sniffed the air and smelled theft. A hand shot out of a side corridor and grabbed Hermione's arm. Yaxley, Corbin, his face twisted with triumph. "Got you!" Hermione shrieked, yanking back, but his grip was iron. Harry spun, wand up. "Stupefy!" The curse hit Corbin in the chest. His eyes went wide. He fell, but his hand didn't release Hermione fast enough. She tore free, stumbling, but Harry saw the terrible thing. Corbin's fingers had hooked into her sleeve in the exact moment she began to apparate. "He touched me," Hermione gasped, eyes wild. He? No time," Ron shouted, grabbing Harry's shoulder. Hermione seized them both. "Now!" They apparated. The world twisted, compressed, screamed. They landed in a forest clearing at dusk. Cold air hit Harry's lungs like a slap. He stumbled forward and fell to his hands and knees, gagging. The ground was damp with moss. Trees rose around them like tall, indifferent witnesses. Hermione collapsed against a trunk, panting, hair plastered to her forehead. Ron doubled over, hands on his thighs, retching. For a moment, none of them could speak. Harry's pocket felt heavy. The locket lay against his thigh like a bruise. When he finally dared to breathe properly, he looked up at the darkening sky. Birds called somewhere far away. The world smelled of earth and leaves and distance. It smelled like exile. Hermione wiped her mouth with a shaking hand. Poor Bon. He might have been pulled with us, she whispered, voice horrified. I didn't. Harry, I didn't. We'll deal with it, Harry said, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. His scar pulsed again, sending a spike of anger through him that wasn't his, that tasted like bile and superiority. He squeezed his eyes shut and forced the feeling down. Ron stared at them both, face pale. We can't go back, he said hoarsely, and it sounded like a realization more than a statement. We can't go anywhere. Harry reached into his pocket and drew the locket out. In the fading light, it looked almost beautiful. The gold caught Dusk like a last ember. It could have been a family heirloom, a lover's gift. It could have been harmless, but Harry felt the wrongness in it immediately. The air seemed to tighten. The clearing felt smaller. His thoughts became louder, harsher. A whisper seemed to curl at the edge of hearing. Not words exactly, but an invitation to despair. Hermione's eyes fixed on it, and Harry saw a flicker of fear there that she couldn't quite hide. Ron's mouth tightened, his gaze darkening. Harry held the locket out for them to see. This is it, he said quietly. This is what we came for. The locket hung between them like a curse. In the distance, a wind rose, moving through the trees with a sound like breathing. The night deepened. The world was vast and empty, and the only warmth they had left was each other. Harry closed his fingers around the locket and felt it press back, cold and patient, as if it could wait forever. He looked at Ron and Hermione. We keep going, he said, and his voice was steady even as everything inside him shook. Whatever it takes. Hermione nodded, jaw clenched, tears bright in her eyes but not falling. Ron nodded too, swallowing hard like he was swallowing fear. And in the shadowed forest, with the Ministry fallen and the Burrow behind them and the locket heavy as a stone, they made themselves into something new. Not students, not children, but 3 people walking forward because stopping meant surrender. The night swallowed the clearing, and they began to move.